So, I think when most people think of creation spirituality, it's the material that I'm doing tonight that is more in mind. I think that's the thing that we associate with Matthew Fox and this whole line of thought, so maybe this will be more familiar territory to many. Might start by asking, how many people have read Matthew Fox's book, Original Blessing? That's amazing. There's probably not many other books you could mention and see that many people who have read it. Well, it's going to be interesting to see tonight whether we can say things about this or put it into context that's going to help people who have read the book, because I'm very much drawing on that this evening. Well, in the other lectures, I included a number of other theologians and so on, and really dealing much more with Fox's own ideas tonight. So the whole idea, the question is talking about original sin, and I'm really using that as a category to think about, as Matthew Fox does, for everything that's bad in the world. It's sort of a way of summing up the kind of negative outlook on life and so on that many Christians have grown up with. That's really what we're attacking tonight. When the other night we attacked the environmental crisis or patriarchy, tonight it's really an attempt to look at an alternative to the negative spirituality that many people remember from school days or adulthood, as the case may be. So that it has many kind of characteristics to it that we sort of recognize. It's dominated by thoughts of sin and damnation. Maybe in our American tradition, the notion that captures it best is Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." That becomes one way of thinking of sinners in the hands of an angry God, as this sort of image that people are hanging by a thread over the fires of hell. And it would be very easy for God to cut that thread and for people to fall down. The image I've often used is it's life on a tightrope. So the one's walking on a tightrope, and the great fear is that one's going to fall off. Meaning one falls off into serious sin or falls off into damnation. And it is a scary kind of experience. It's sort of restricting and constraining for people, and there's a lot of fear connected with all of that. Now, there's images connected with this kind of lifestyle we're talking about. In this picture, God is often seen as a very stern judge, as one who's sort of just waiting to see if you make a mistake, and one is going to get zapped for it. God is often thought of as the bookkeeper, keeping notes on people to see how many pluses and minuses, and if you don't have the right amount, one is going to be damned forever. Out of all of that grows very negative outlooks on bodliness, on sexuality, on pleasure. Those things are seen as sort of detriments, things that take one away from God. The spiritual life has to do with the soul, and the soul getting to God. And the spiritual life has to do with being in church. And all these other things get in the way. Things like our bodliness. A special danger has always been attached to sexuality in this outlook, and the pleasures connected with sex. So that one of the touchstones for whether one had done something wrong in one's mind was whether one took pleasure in thoughts or not. If one took pleasure in sexual thoughts, then it was seen to be sinful, and very often even mortally sinful. We had this interesting idea of the development of the notion of limbo connected with this. It was thought when babies were born that they were in original sin, and that if you didn't get them baptized quickly, they would not get to heaven. In Augustine's idea, they would go to hell. But those people who wanted to soften some of Augustine's teaching came up with a clever idea of limbo, so that we wouldn't have to say these innocent babies were damned to hell, but we would end up saying that, they went to sort of a neutral place of natural happiness, but could not go to heaven. And that gave us all kinds of practices. That meant we had to baptize babies in a hurry. Sometimes even mothers weren't present for the baptisms. And a lot of fear connected with that. If babies weren't baptized right away and died, they would not get to heaven. And in addition, this thought fostered a lot of the dualisms. We concentrated on that last week, dualisms between body and soul, between grace and nature, between humans and non-humans, between God and people. A lot of splits, sharp dichotomies, hard to get them together. Like here's the world of theology, for example. That deals with revelation. And over here is the world of philosophy and reason. And it's very difficult to get those together in any way. What you really have to have is this supernatural knowledge that only we can get from the scriptures and so on. So that's a rough picture that we all recognize, and that's what Matthew Fox has really identified. Matthew Fox, Dominican priest, writes in the area of spirituality. One of his books, Original Blessing. The other major one, The Coming of the Cosmic Christ. And for our purposes tonight, another book that he edited about Eckhart called Breakthrough. Meister Eckhart's Creation, Spirituality, and New Translation. And other books like On Becoming a Musical Mystical Bear and We, All the Way Home. As I said in the first class, it really is hard to imagine people in the Vatican feeling a need to condemn those kinds of books. However, they have, and silenced Matthew Fox, and has thought of his book, Original Blessing, which we talk about tonight, as really being dangerous in many ways. So what is it that Fox has done that strikes so many responsive chords? And I think that, it's interesting. I really don't think there's many other books I could mention that many people in the audience would have read. Anyway, what has he done? He's identified all those bad things I talked about, and in very striking ways. And he points them out as negative spirituality. But not only that, he collects them and gives them a face and a name that we can really attack. And he attributes it all to St. Augustine. All these bad things that have happened come from St. Augustine, who died in the 5th century. So it's a nice whipping boy to put out front here where we can attack. And it's a sort of an easy explanation of how these things have gone badly. But not only that, he identifies the bad person, but then he creates something else. He creates a whole positive response to all of these bad things, and he names it creation spirituality. He pulls together all kind of positive understandings from the faith and an integrated, holistic approach, and says, well, that's what creation spirituality is. And this is a far better way to live than all these negative sort of approaches to life. And he goes on with a further claim that you can find that creation spirituality throughout the tradition. In fact, he thinks it's the oldest biblical tradition. He relates it to the Yahwist, the author in the Hebrew Scriptures, who wrote the second creation account as we have it, but he's the older author. He says there's a creation spirituality person, creation theologian right from the beginning, and you can trace it all the way through history of Christian thought. There is this entity that he names creation spirituality. You can find it in the Hebrew prophets. You can find it especially in Jesus. And then throughout the tradition, certain great figures like St. Irenaeus, who came from the East and then located in the West. Much more found in Eastern Christianity than Western thought. And then especially in what we call the Rhineland mystics from the medieval world, a number of whom are women. Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich, and, well, she isn't one of the Rhineland mystics, but the main one being Meister Eckhart. So he becomes his hero kind of person, the antithesis of everything that St. Augustine stood for. So that's, the background to all of this. I mean, I think that's what Matthew Fox has fundamentally done. There's a point that I tried to make last week again is that Matthew Fox does not really function as a traditional systematic theologian. In fact, the systematic theologians do not take him seriously. He functions in another way. He functions, I think, as a poet. He functions as a spiritual guide, a guru. He might function as what we call a spiritual theologian. In other words, he doesn't work the way the traditional systematic theologians have done by a careful, balanced reading of the tradition and trying to retrieve certain ideas and see what's positive and negative and work it all out. He really doesn't like the way the systematic theologians work. He attacks them. Maybe that's one reason they don't take him seriously. He attacks many things. He attacks St. Ignatius in the spiritual exercises. He often attacks Jesuits for their overly rational, cerebral approach to spirituality. And he creates this other thing that he calls creation spirituality. So that's something of how I see Fox. And my reflections are that I try to deal with him that way. I mean, I think from a critical viewpoint, there's all kind of ways he is open to attack. But I'm not sure where that gets anyone. What I'd rather do is with most thinkers, is see what he has positive to say that could help us to grow and develop in many ways. Anybody want to ask me anything up to that point? That's all background, introductory kind of material. Okay, the next thing I did was try to take what I would think of as some of the presuppositions involved in his thought. And maybe I've already said this in one way or another, but what Fox thinks is that happens is this, that religion really does two kinds of things for people. It has a salvific side. One thing that religion says is that everything's screwed up, things are wrong, the human situation's flawed, the human heart is defective, we are prone to sin and guilt, death takes us over, and so religions have the function of saving. All religions in history, as near as I can figure out, have thought of it that way. That life is messed up, and therefore we've got a prophetic figure or a body of knowledge, a wisdom, that tells us how to deal with it. So that's what the Buddha says. Buddha says life is suffering, it's pain, but I can tell you how to deal with it. If you could just get rid of your craving, then you'd be fine, because that's what causes the suffering. So get rid of the craving and you'll be all right. No, Judaism has the same idea that we are in a flawed situation, but if one is attentive to the law and follows the law and lives out the covenant of love, that you can be saved from all of that. So that's one side of what we find in religious traditions. It's a salvation approach to something that's messed up. But Fox claims there's another side to religion. And that is, he names it the blessing side is over against the deliverance side, the salvation side. There's a blessing side. And the word blessing is extremely important for Fox, and he uses it throughout. It's the name of his book, Original Blessing. Now, blessings in the Scriptures, and that's where you get it, refers to something God does. It's a gift lavished by God on His creation, on the inanimate creation, the birds and the animals and the plants, and on humans. And what blessing does is make something fertile. It makes it increase and multiply. To bless something, to bless Abraham meant he was going to have a lot of kids, a lot of descendants. Well, to bless the creation meant it would be fruitful and it would multiply. Blessing is something only God can do, nobody else. We can ask God to bless somebody else, but we can't bless them ourselves. We can in turn bless God, because God, as Jesus said, well, the Spirit is within us, groaning so that we can say positive things to God. So there's a way out of the power of the Spirit we can bless God and that really means that we thank God for everything He's done for us. So that's the other side of it. There's a blessing side to religion, he thinks. And that what has happened in the history of Judeo-Christian thought is the deliverance, salvation side has just gotten very powerful and big, and the other side of blessing, original blessing, has been lost. And that really becomes his mission, is how do you recover that? How do you get it back in working order, and stress that more? Then the next presupposition is the way he thinks about original sin. For him, original sin is really an invention of Augustine. Up till that time, he thinks the Jews had no idea of original sin. He quotes Elie Wiesel in that regard, the great writer about the Holocaust, who says that. He thinks really Augustine made that all up in the 5th century. And he says that really that's the doctrine then that messed us up and gave us this poor image of God, poor self-image, poor attitudes towards sexuality, and all of the rest of it. That is what has happened. That's even enabled us. It's caused the Marxist critique. He thinks that that's why we've been passive in the face of injustices, and why we've accepted all the dualisms that are involved in the patriarchal system, a dualism between men and women. Remember, to refresh your memory on dualism, the analysis of that is that as soon as you separate out and say we got two things, soul and body, men and women, humans and non-humans, one or the other will always get into the ascendancy and take over and be superior, meaning the other element will be oppressed. So we've seen that in the history of thought, where the soul is thought to be great and powerful and good, and the body was thought to be bad and evil and take us in the wrong direction. Same thing can often be said for the way men and women have been compared. So he sees, again, this original sin as being part of it. Remember that one of Fox's lines is, and he got this reading from somebody else, that is that the sin behind all other sins is really dualism. That's the key. That is, for him, that is the original sin. Not what Adam and Eve did in the garden, but the original sin for him is dualism. That separating out, dichotomizing, and then making one or the other superior. Now, I might say, in response to this, that I really don't agree with all of that. It seems to me, whatever you name it, there's always been a sense of original sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It comes right in the story at the beginning of Adam and Eve. It's hard for me to imagine how you can just discount that whole thing that's put at the beginning of the whole thing, of the Scriptures. That is, Adam and Eve are in a garden, and everything's fine, and they sin, and after they sin, what happens is the world is messed up. They're messed up, and the world's messed up. And so the notion, I think you already get, is that something's wrong. I mean, I don't care what you call it, but the world is not in good working order, nor is the human heart in good working order from the very beginning, according to the book of Genesis. And I think that's the presupposition of the whole rest of the Scriptures. Without that notion, you can't really function. I mean, you can't understand what, and then the rest of it's about, because the rest of it is God's effort to restore the creation, to get it back in working order, to restore paradise, to bring people back to himself. That's why he forms a people, to be a light to the nations, to show people how they're supposed to function. So whether you use the word or not, it's hard for me to get away from the idea that right at the beginning of the Judeo-Christian tradition there is this sense that it is flawed. And the contention is that that's because human beings disobeyed God. As Reinhold Niebuhr said, he sees it the opposite way. It's not going to throw out original sin. His idea is that original sin is the one empirically verifiable doctrine we've got. I mean, that's the one thing that we are sure about. That is that the human situation is flawed. I mean, people get sick, and they get old, and they don't like to be old, and they get tired, and bones and joints don't work, and people don't do what they should do. Paul saw the same thing long before Augustine. I don't do what I should do. I do things I know I shouldn't do. So it seems to me there's a constant tradition throughout that where the reality of original sin is at work. Fox's idea is that it really is a late invention and by Augustine. Then comes the main figure that he draws on, and that is Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart is a fascinating person, and you will get very different viewpoints of Eckhart. In your notes, I've just given a reminder of where he was, and born 1260 thereabouts, and so on. He became a Dominican. He's like Thomas Aquinas in that. They're both Dominicans. Thomas Aquinas died in 1274, so Eckhart was very influenced by him. He went to the University of Paris, studied there. That's where he got the title Meister or Master. He got his master's degree, and it's forever after, Paul, that's not his first name, Meister. That's a title. Meister Eckhart, his first name is Johannes. It's like thinking that Jesus' last name is Christ, I suppose. Anyway, it's Meister Eckhart, that's his title, and he went around and he wrote in his grand scheme of how he's going to write this great theology work, like Aquinas had done, writing the Summa, but he never got around to doing it. And he eventually left the University of Paris, and he went back to Germany, and he became a preacher. He's really a preacher, and he's got all kinds of sermons. So among his writings, we've got these Latin works that are rather ponderous and so on. Then we've got these sermons that that his listeners copied down and kept. And so for the last 100 years, they've been trying to sort this all out in Germany to find out what he really wrote and didn't write, and they're getting these critical texts together and so on. And they're getting his Latin works together, and they'll be going on probably another 100 years to collect everything that Eckhart wrote and figure out what he really said and so on. There's been a great birth of interest in Eckhart these days, and what you end up seeing is that there are very different ways of interpreting him. Now, Matthew Fox has written one book on Eckhart, and that I've noted it in the listing here. It's called that book Breakthrough, which is one of Eckhart's major ideas. I think if you want what I would think of as a more balanced and scholarly approach to Eckhart, then I would read the previous two books that I've mentioned in the bibliography here. Eckhart, Teacher and Preacher, and his Essential Sermons. That's part of the Paulus Press Classics of Western Spirituality thing. I think there you will find a very more balanced, careful, scholarly approach to Eckhart. About the most I can say for Fox's approach to Eckhart is that it picks up one theme in his thought and plays it out. I mean, I could say that more critically and say if you read Fox's treatment of Eckhart, you're going to get a very one-sided approach to him. But Eckhart, is a fascinating sort of writer. His perspective constantly changes, his language changes. He says the most outrageous things. I sometimes think that Matthew Fox is really the modern-day Eckhart. Not comparing him in terms of greatness, but in similar sort of paradoxical language of really slanted approaches to things, of saying outrageous things to get you. The thing is like Matthew Fox saying, well, my spiritual director is my dog. He says that his spiritual director is his dog. Well, scholars read that and say, well, what does that mean? And other people are into it and say, that's right. That's really wise. You have a dog as a spiritual director. Some other people might say they have dogs as spiritual directors. I didn't really mean any offense to the spiritual directors present. Some seem to take it personally. I have to watch what you say. Sorry, Diane, I didn't. Anyway,
I mean, Eckhart says, he didn't say a spiritual director is his dog, but I mean, he says other things like that that are really hard to understand, or you sit there and figure, well, what might he mean by all of this? So Eckhart is a strange figure and hard to understand in many ways, but Fox takes him as the great model for creation spirituality. He's the one he sees as polar opposite of Augustine. If we could just get back to Eckhart, everything would be great. I did a little thing in my Reflections article. I don't know if anybody saw that yet or not, but it'd be interesting. See if I could find this here. Yes, here's in the Reflections article, a little text. These are quotes. Now you tell me, are they from Augustine or Eckhart? Okay? Here's the quote. To be empty of all created things is to be full of God. And to be full of created things is to be empty of God. Augustine or Eckhart? Wrong. Eckhart. I give you another one. No one can accept fleshly and bodily consolations without spiritual damage. Augustine or Eckhart? Some have learned the game. That's Eckhart also. And then, finally, the sooner a man shuns what is created, the sooner will the Creator come to him. That also is Meister Eckhart. Now, I've raised that simply to show that the idea that there are these two distinct traditions, and one very positive, that represented by Eckhart, and one very negative by Augustine, is probably a sort of simplistic way of looking at the tradition. If you read, I could read positive quotes from Augustine that praise creation and glorify the world and talk about the goodness of the world and so on that you'd find in Augustine. So, it just, and I've only, at one point in saying that is, it's not so simple as just saying there's a good guy and a bad guy in the history of our Christian thought. Be that as it may, I'm going to move now to talking about the positive side of this and what Matthew Fox might tell us. And here, I'm summarizing Original Blessing, and hoping the people who have read the book won't be bored, I guess, and not knowing quite what to do about that. We should have asked last week how many people had read this, and I would have prepared the class differently. But there I am, and thus it be. What he does in the book is really, he's got 4 paths that he thinks we need to follow. And they're all very cleverly put about befriending. So he wants us to befriend creation. I'm just looking ahead here, and then I will go back and talk about each one. He wants us to befriend creation, the created world, see its goodness, and then he wants us to befriend the darkness. That's sort of his theology of the cross, as I say it here. Then he wants us to befriend our own creativity, what we can produce. And then finally, we want to befriend what he calls the new creation, the works of justice and so on. Now, what I've done is sort of go through these chapter by chapter and sort of try to see what I think his theological basis for his statements are, and then to show what flows from it. So each one of the next 26 items have the same structure. That is, I want to say what theology is behind it, and then what does that mean for our spiritual growth? And I must say, I think a lot of these things are tremendous. I'm not in a critical mode here at all. I put in mostly things that I can affirm or that I think are good as I read it. The stuff that I didn't like in there, I left out. And the stuff I could easily shoot down in a way. I don't want to do that. I want to take them at its best, what I think. And so it's sort of what you get is a dialogue between me and Matthew Fox, and try to see where that takes us. So, the first thing that we got to do is befriend creation. See, this is his theology of incarnation and creation. So the first theological point that he makes is that creation is ongoing. It's not something that just happened like 20 billion years ago, as he said, that with the Big Bang that God made everything and then creation ended, and it's sort of like a clock that he wound up and it's going to keep running until the sun blows up and then 4 more billion years from now. That isn't what it means. So for him, and this is standard fare now for many people, creation is continuing. God's creative activity is still going on now. God is at work making this world and transforming it and so on. And so he has a good way of saying that. He talks about it as an unfolding of God's Word. I take you back to Meister Eckhart. One of Eckhart's way of understanding the Christian faith is very verbal as opposed to visual. In other words, Eckhart's imagery is verbal. He talks a lot about the Word. What is crucial to Eckhart is the Word. God speaks the Word into the silence, and the Word creates, and everything unfolds from that. So through the Word of God, everything is sort of emanating from God. That's what the Platonists said. Eckhart is what many people call a Neoplatonist. Fox denies that, but I think that's what he is. So everything emanates out from God. He speaks and it happens. But then everything's got to go back to God. Everything that's made, us included, our big job is to get back to God. And it's a very verbal kind of thing. We will eventually sort of move back into the silence of the Godhead as he talks about it. Move back in there. So, this is this dynamic sense of creation. It's the unfolding of God's Word. And that makes a difference. That means now there's a second theological statement that's important here. And that is that the world itself, the whole of creation, is a sacrament. That's familiar to many people as well. I think common talk is. It's not just like there's 7 sacraments, but the whole world is sacramental. The whole world, what that means is it's a sign of God's presence. Okay. Now, therefore, in all of these things, and then something follows from this. What if all of that is true? Then the key to life, what we ought to do is to cultivate awareness. We ought to be aware of the ongoing creation, aware of the new things that are happening. We should be able to look at the flower and see in the flower the image of God. We ought to be able to look at the whole of creation and see God present there because everything is a sacrament. Sense the presence of the Spirit. That creates a whole spirituality. So what I'm trying to do now is develop a positive, integrated spirituality. And part of the first step is awareness. So to cultivate self-awareness, religious self-awareness. That's one of the themes that I like to develop. I mean, I often say it this way, we have to be on alert. It's the scriptural idea, be awake. Be awake because you might miss it. The creation that's going on, you got to be awake and alert, on alert for what God is doing, which is often new and surprising for us. So a new creation is happening. Second, creation is a blessing from God. Now, I already talked about that, what blessing means. It's got to do with fertility, with increase, multiplying. God blesses when He made the earth, He blessed it, He blessed people, and so on. And because God made it that way, therefore, something should happen with us. We should savor its pleasures. Now we get a whole reversal here. And this is a major shift in that it needs to occur in spirituality, it seems to me, that pleasure is seen as something good and not bad. Pleasure shouldn't take us away from God, it should take us toward God. Pleasure is one of the great allies we have in developing the spiritual life. It's as simple as choosing an exercise that one likes. It's pleasurable, because then there's a lot better chance you're going to keep doing it. What we want to do is get in the spiritual life where acting like Jesus acted is easy and pleasurable, not hard. It doesn't, it's the opposite of the notion that the harder it is, the better it is. The more displeasure it brings us, the more Christian it is, or the more virtuous. So here we're seeing pleasure in a positive light. And that's also contained in Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas taught that a long time ago, that pleasure is our ally in the growth process. So that could be played out in many different ways. I suppose the clearest way would be to see it in terms of sexuality. And we talked about that last time in exegeting the Song of Songs as Fox would see it. So pleasure as being something good and can move us closer to God. Then, next point, the theological point, which is really sort of combined with a scientific point. That is, we are products of the earth. We're what the evolutionary process has produced. There's an interesting word play here that Fox likes. The word for the earth is humus. And it's the same word that is the root for humility. So he says, if you take this that we are products of the earth, we're rooted in the earth, rooted in this world of ours, and part of the physical evolution of the whole world, where evolution becomes conscious of itself, if all of that is true, then humility will look very different. Humility will not be walking around saying, I'm no good, and everyone else is better than I am, and so on. What it will mean instead is keeping our 2 feet on the ground, being rooted, celebrating our earthiness, our bodiliness, our sensuality, and so on. And again, that will lead to certain practices. It would suggest very simple living styles. Instead of putting on airs or having to have the best of everything, that one would do something else, that is, live simply, because we are products of the earth. Also, it's that same notion that leads to the care for the environment, which would be so crucial. All of this is opposed to the traditional heresy we call docetism, that is, that looked down on the body, Gnosticism that said that the body and earthiness and all of that is bad. We rather should celebrate that. Next point is, it's a theology of grace in a sense. What he wants to say is that everything in the world is inspirited. There's one spirit in the whole world. God's word that is spoken emanates in the spirit and pulls everything together, reconciles, holds it together. And what that means is that everything is interconnected in the world. Everything is divinized by grace. Now what that's going to do, he thinks, is give us a very different idea of spirituality. Here again, the whipping boy is Augustine. He said, see, Augustine's famous work that influenced so much is called the Confessions. And what Augustine did in the Confessions is look within and check out what's going on inside. It's very introspective. It's very turned in. And what Fox thinks happens from Augustine's great influence then is that spirituality is thought of as sort of inside. And it's just me and God and me and grace and me and sins that are inside of me. It gives us a sort of examination of conscience mentality that, boy, I got to really zero in and make sure my motives are right and that I got everything in proper working order. It's sort of a tight, constricted approach to the spiritual life, introspective, as he said. And he says what he wants to do is to broaden that out and say, no, I want what he calls a cosmic spirituality. A cosmic spirituality looks out. Maybe goes out at night and looks up at the stars and lets that move them to prayer. Cosmic spirituality realizes this is a big world. Maybe it ends up praying more when it says we're the product of 15 billion years of God's effort. That that's what moves one to prayer more than just going inside and looking within. And one gets a sense here as well that spirituality's got to do with not just me, but justice, ordering the world, creating a better place. This spirituality means that beauty would be essential. And notice that Fox does not quote the great theologian of beauty in the 20th century, and that's Hans Urs von Balthasar, who wrote his whole 16 volumes around the notion of beauty being at the very beginning of theological thought. He said, instead of thinking about, well, how can I be good, or what's the truth I'm seeking, he said what you should do to really get a proper outlook on what life is all about is start out by appreciating beauty. Beauty's first, before everything else. Start out with that appreciating the flowers and the birds and the sky and the marvels of the human body and the mystery and chemistry of sexuality. Start out with that, and then you'll get in better order how you're supposed to be good and what the truth is. So it's a reversal of the three great ideas that have been throughout Western thought: truth, goodness, and beauty. It's cosmic spirituality wants to get beauty back there closer in the center of the whole thing. Why is that? Because beauty has to do with ordering and with relationships. And once we begin to see that, then everything will look better to us. Next major point is our image of God. Who is God in this spirituality is not a bookkeeper and he's not a judge, but he's the trustworthy one. The major theme throughout creation spirituality is trust. The world is worthy of trust. God is the one who's in charge of it all, and he makes sure that it's going well. Therefore, that means something about us. We're supposed to get away from fear. Fear becomes the great danger to the spiritual life. Now, a lot of times that's what we thought we'd use. We'd make people afraid of hell, then they'd shape up and be better. Make them afraid that they're mortal sin, and then they would live a more Christian life. This approach is just the opposite of that. It says fear gets in your way. What we need is more positive kinds of motivation that we're supposed to trust and be able to accept. What it means is sort of a letting go, as we'll see that is throughout his whole thought here. It means to let go and accept reality. And I must say here, you can link this with what a lot of the psychologists tell us. That maturity has to do with accepting life on its own terms. Accepting reality as it comes, to accepting the cards that we've been dealt, and not railing against it. That's what Ronner says. You get two choices in life. You can be mad about what you've been dealt and walk around and kick your feet and wonder why it's got to be like this. Why is terrible the cross that I have to bear? Or one can accept life with some sort of equanimity of spirit, some sort of calmness. And again, I think that's what Fox is bringing out. Acceptance, even that would take one up to the point of death. Number 6 is still another idea about God, and that is his key phrase for understanding who God is, and that is that we call it panentheism. Now, people recognize the word as pantheism. Pantheism means an identification. God is the world is God. And what panentheism means for Fox and for the tradition generally, I would say, is that it's not that God is the world, but God is in the world, and the world is in God. Close kind of relationship. But I think he's got a lot, that's an abstract phrase, panentheism. I think when Fox moves to his maternal imagery, it all comes to life. And so his imagery is very much one of embracing and encompassing and holding and drawing close. It is a maternal kind of imagery. It's to talk about God as the mother who wants to gather and keep close and reconcile, embrace, hug. All of those close notions of God, panentheism, therefore lead to something. It leads us to say, well, this is the same conclusion we reach with other ideas, that we have to find God within ourselves and in other things. We have to find God in the reconciling gesture. And I think that's very real. I mean, how often would it be that when somebody really forgives us or says it's okay or welcomes us or smiles at us when we walk in a room of strangers, all that embracing, reconciling notion is precisely where we get some feel of a God who loves us, a tender God. I think that's very real for many people. I'm going to try to finish this first part before we take a break. Number 7, he tries to see something good in the language about king, what a king does. God is a king, means that he orders the world. But more than that he calls the people to be members of his kingdom. The royal king isn't just aloof from us, but invites us to share in the whole ruling process, the whole ordering process. Therefore, key theme, we have responsibility to carry on this work of God in 2 ways: to take care of this earth of ours, overcome the environmental crises, to treasure it, and we have the task of ordering, getting right relationships going, which we associate with justice. Number 8 has to do with our outlook on time. And time is crucial to how we understand ourselves. You know, you can get messed up in so many ways. The past can haunt us. I was talking to the student recently, that did something in the past and they just can't move beyond it, and that just is messing his head up, and he just can't forgive himself for it, and he's got to find a way to move beyond that. The past can mess us up. The present can be out of order because we're not involved in it. We're in a room like this and supposedly listening to a lecture, but our mind is 100 miles away. And the future messes us up because it produces too much anxiety. Keeps us from doing anything constructive. Keeps us from making the next step because we're afraid of failing or that it won't go right. So Fox has got a theological point here, which it grows out of the point I made before, the theology that creation is ongoing. God is still creating the world. Similar point. Therefore, that makes a difference. We should be alert, therefore, to God's presence in the now because he's making the world.
At this point, please stop the tape and turn it over to side 2 to continue.